Thanks, brother. Appreciate it, Lou. Never know what he's going to say. The legend grows. I'm now 56. He keeps changing my age on me. Well, in light of Vince's story earlier, I'm actually one of the few people probably that got actual coal in their stocking. I woke up Christmas morning, I had coal in my stocking. And I kind of knew it was my mom because it was in a Ziploc bag so it wouldn't make a mess. So kind of gave it away there. Sorry, Mom. But yeah, so tonight, God, who are you? I want to start with a little story. Many people who know me know this story. I'm asked to tell it quite a bit because it's an interesting story. I'm going to be very brief, though. It's a much longer story than I can tell you. My wife and I, when we moved to Sudan as missionaries, we lived in a mud hut. We hiked about 35 minutes to get our water. We never touched Sudanese money. Soap and salt was our currency. There were goats eating my garden. It was very far out there. They built an airstrip in order for us to get into the area. And after about 8 months there, a problem arose. There was a bunch of chanting going on this little mountain, and I asked everyone, what's going on? What's going on over there? They said they're praying to God for rain. We're praying to God for rain. There's been a drought. Okay, I can get behind that. We're praying to God for rain. Great. The belief system up there is animism. I won't go into all of that animism is. So it's animistic people group, and they're praying to God for rain. The next day, our compound with the clinic gets stormed by about 150, 200 people with AK-47s and machetes. Our team leader's taken. 2 women on the team are taken, and they're put on trial for affecting the weather patterns. We essentially were accused of stealing the rain, and I was called by my wife from the porch. I was out gathering sticks to fix our fence. Again, the goats kept eating in the garden. And we had to get up to our team leader's compound and pray. And ends up, it got late, and the elder of the area, after the witch doctor was getting everybody all riled up, the elder of the area said, it's late, and turned to our team leader, said, bring a bull, like cow, bring a bull tomorrow to sacrifice, otherwise we're going to kill you all. And he says, I don't have a bull, and at this hour, where would I find one? He said, bring a bull tomorrow, or you all die. So they let them go, to get the bull. So that night, we hiked out 10 miles through the night, left at 1 in the morning, got to the airstrip far away that we could get out of there safe enough by 7:30 in the morning. Couldn't use flashlights because of light pollution. We used fire, so we were the few people with flashlights, you'd be able to see them. Why do I tell you all this at the beginning of a talk on God, who are you? They were praying to God for rain. I was praying to God for rain. Their conclusion was, I should die, or a sacrifice needs to be made. Some kind of sacrifice needs to be made. So when we talk about God, I don't think we're always talking about the same thing. It brought to the question, who is this? Who's the God that they understand they're praying to? Who's the God who I'm praying to? And I wonder for you guys, if I were to ask you to define God, what would you say? Think to yourself, what would you say? If someone asked you to define God, what would you say? What is God like? God, I find, is actually an ambiguous term. I don't find it very helpful in conversation because many people use it, but they mean very different things. We have the God who is an uninvolved creator of deism. He created, got the top spinning, but then hands off, not involved at all. You have God as a force of energy, basically he's a force. There's some, it's kind of an impersonal force. There's some more New Age aspects in there. Some people say that God doesn't exist, but then they actually concern themselves with a lot of time criticizing this God that doesn't exist. I love this quote by Richard Dawkins. I think I first heard it from Joe Vitale. It sounds much better when she reads it with her English accent, which you'll hear tomorrow. It says, the God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction, jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully. Big list of what he thinks about the God who does not exist. And when I'm struck in these conversations, and I'm struck with the impression that some people talk about God when I say, like, who's this God? Who is God to you? If they describe him like that, I'll actually agree with them. Say, I'm with you. I actually don't believe in that God either. Not one bit. But then I want to talk about who the God is that I do believe in. And that's what we want to talk about tonight. Who is this God revealed in Scripture? So all of this to say, when talking about God, it is not safe to assume that we all mean the same thing just because we're using the same word. Important for us to remember. There's also the question I remember asking, I think I was probably 5 or so, my poor mom, tucking me into bed, and I look up at her. Mom, who created God? Anybody ever ask that question? Come on. Nobody? Yeah, okay, thank you. Who created God? To which she answered, go to sleep, honey. That's my mom's answer. I think, as I remember it, she'll probably correct me. If you are a Christian and you feel a little bit stuck there, you feel a little bit stumped by that question, who created God? It's okay. It actually shouldn't make sense to you. It should stump you a little bit. And like, well, yeah, what do I believe about that? Because in Christianity, we are not talking about a created God. Oftentimes people talk about God as if he's more in like the Greek system where you have these different gods that were created because of reflection upon nature. And they put God in that category and maybe make him the greatest. So they could say, yeah, God, the creator, is the greatest. But he's still within the created order. And the God of the Bible is actually outside of the created order. The God we are talking about is the creator and sustainer of all that exists. The one who exists outside of the created order, beyond space and time. The one who started the timeline that we exist within. In order to start a timeline, you have to be outside of it. And if you feel like when you start to reflect on this and think about God, and you feel like your mind might explode, like that's okay. It's actually an appropriate response to feel like, I just can't comprehend this. I heard one person say once, if you think you've comprehended God, he's no longer God. And this is why the Bible starts by saying, in the beginning, God. Not in the beginning God began, not in the beginning God was created. He is not a created God. However, the Bible talks about created gods. They're called idols. One of my favorite sections of Scripture is a place that I think has some pretty extreme sarcasm. And it's actually one of my favorite. I am an athlete, Lou. Thank you very much. I love basketball, and there's a lot of trash talking that goes on in basketball. And those who have played with me know that I'll talk a little trash. And I love the fact that there's a passage in the Scriptures that I really feel like it's almost like God's throwing down trash talking a bit of sarcasm. If you ever thought there wasn't sarcasm in the Bible, just check this out. We're in Isaiah 44. It's a pretty long section. I'm going to read Isaiah 44, and we'll start in verse 9. It says, all who make idols are nothing, and the things they treasure are worthless. Those who would speak up for them are blind. They are ignorant to their own shame. Who shapes a god and casts an idol which can profit nothing? People who do that will be put to shame. Such craftsmen are only human beings. Let them all come together and take their stand, and they'll be brought down to terror and shame. Now listen to this. He starts talking about the blacksmith. The blacksmith takes a tool. Yes, he needs a tool. Okay, and works with it in the coals. He shapes an idol with hammers. He forges it with the might of his arm. It's kind of funny. With the might of his arm, he forges this idol. Okay, he gets hungry and loses his strength. He drinks no water and grows faint. So he's talking about his might, how mighty this man's arm is, and then he gets tired while he's making a god. The carpenter measures with a line and makes an outline with a marker. He roughs it with a chisel and marks it with a compass. He shapes it in human form in all its glory, that it may dwell in a shrine. He cut down cedars and perhaps a cypress or an oak. He let it grow among the trees of the forest. He planted a pine, and the rain made it grow. And who gave the rain? He doesn't say that. I'm just asking that question. It is used as fuel for burning. Some of it he takes and warms himself. He kindles a fire and bakes bread. He also fashions a god and worships it. He makes an idol and bows down to it. Half of the wood he burns in the fire, and over it he prepares a meal. He roasts the meat and eats to his fill. He also warms himself and says, "Ah, I am warm. I see the fire." From the rest he makes a god, his idol. He bows down to it and worships. He prays to it and says, "Save me, you are my God." They know nothing. They understand nothing. Their eyes are plastered over. They cannot see, and their minds closed. They cannot understand. No one stops to think. No one has the knowledge or understanding to say, half of it I used for fuel. I even baked bread over its coals. I roasted meat and I ate. Shall I make a detestable thing from what is left? Shall I bow down to a block of wood? Such a person feeds on ashes. A deluded heart misleads him. He cannot save himself. It is not this thing, or say, is not this thing in my right hand a lie? I love this. He's basically saying, he's painting this picture. It's like, you take this block of wood, and you're going to take half of it, and you're going to burn it. And you're going to burn it in order to feed yourself because you're so weak, and you need this nourishment. You're going to feed yourself with this. It's going to be the fuel. And then you're going to take the other half of this same thing that was your sustenance here, and the source of heating your sustenance and warming you, you're so dependent upon. And then you're going to come over here and you're going to shape this into a little, whatever form, this little wood, and then you're going to worship it and say, "Save me." And he's like, the audacity that you would burn this material and then form a god out of the same material is just audacious. And I love that he's calling this out. And as I the first time I ever read this, I laughed. I was like, this is actually kind of humorous. And we can laugh and we could see some of the humor in this passage even. But oftentimes we can laugh at the silliness of someone bowing down to a block of wood that has been carved into an image without seeing our own idols that we are tempted to bow down to ourselves. I think of things like the approval of others rather than the approval of God. To bow down to that, to seek after that, when you actually think about it, is just as silly. The worship of pleasures that are fleeting, that will only last a moment, rather than the abundant life that God offers. Living for relationships that are not meant to ultimately fulfill, putting them in a place of God, making them an idol, rather than living in the one that does ultimately fulfill. And this is a quote that is often said by John Calvin. He says, "The human heart is an idol factory. It just churns them out. You have to keep guard. It just churns out idols." So although we may not create a god out of a block of wood, we may still be tempted to worship something within the created order rather than the uncreated one. So in Christianity, we are not talking about a created God. We're not talking about a non-personal God who stands off at a distance. We're not talking about a God who is an impersonal force. We're talking about a God who is relational at his core. And one of the ways we talk about God as being relational is his Trinity. And I wish I could go into the Trinity more. It will be on Q&A tomorrow, so feel free to put that question in. I love talking about the Trinity, but basically what we say when we say Trinity, he's one God, one being, that is God, three persons, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. And there's much more that could be said, but really the triune God undergirds a lot of what we believe as Christians. And at the core, what the Trinity, what this triune God tells us is that God is relational. So we can get into that more tomorrow, but tonight I want to just keep moving. And on this idea of being relational, anyone have like an awkward introduction? Ever been in an awkward introduction? Yeah, a lot of us, right? Whether it's from like we don't know whether to do this, like how do we do the handshake thing, right? I didn't find it that awkward, but I met my wife on an ab ball at 24 Hour Fitness. Now, I don't know what she was thinking. She just rolled it up next to me and started talking. No, I was the one that rolled the ball up next to her and started talking to her. It's after she smiled at me, though, so it's her fault. Okay. Now, I don't know how she felt. I would have been a little bit creeped out, but she carried on conversation with me. 9 months later, we're married. That was 15. That was 16 years ago now that I met her. Our first date was June 23rd, 16 years ago. And yeah, we met at the gym on an ab ball. Talk about awkward introductions. I find introductions, though, extremely meaningful and important. I was introducing myself to a little child, and I know the child's 5 because I said, "Hi, what's your name?" "I'm 5. I'm 5. 5. And I wanted to do like the dad joke and go like, "Hi, 5." But like, I refrained, even though I'd be totally justified because I'm a dad. But obviously, this child had just had a birthday, and they were so stoked they were 5 years old. That the name didn't matter one bit. I am 5. That's what I want you to know about me. This is exciting. Here I am. I think about your introduction. What would you include in your introduction? What's important about you? What do you find is the most important thing that you want to communicate when you're saying, "I am Shawn. I am whoever you are"? What are those things that you would include in your introduction? Introductions are important. And I want to look at one place in Scripture where God really defines himself. He introduces himself and who he is and what he's like. If you have a Bible, you could turn to Exodus 34. And Exodus 34, verses 5 through 8, it says, the Lord came down in the cloud and stood there with him and proclaimed his name, the Lord. And he passed in front of Moses, proclaiming, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children to the 3rd and 4th generation. Moses bowed down at once and worshiped. Here, a lot of people quote the beginning of that passage. It's really nice. And then kind of skirt off at the end there. Not sure where to go. And the setting of these words, I mean, we're in Exodus. The people have come out of, Israelites have been led out of Egypt, and they come through this. They've already had the first tablets written, and then Moses comes down, and they're having the big party around the golden calf. We already know about what God thinks about idols, and they're doing the whole idol worship thing. He smashes the tablets. He's going to go up and get some more now here. And in the midst of that, this is what God says. This is who I want you to know that I am. This is how I want you to understand me. So let's go through these a bit slower. He says, he is a God of compassion. Just, I guess even starting at the beginning, the fact that he came down and was with Moses, the fact that he actually was with Moses, stooped to his level. But he's a God of compassion. Compassion, it means he genuinely cares for his people. He truly cares for his people with a deep, deep love and care. It says he's compassionate, he's gracious. When someone's gracious, they do things for people that people don't deserve. You don't deserve this, and I'll do it. He's gracious. He's slow to anger. If you read the story before this, you see clearly he is slow to anger. Abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands. And I love this word, love there, is hesed. And some translations will translate it loyal love. And I love that. It's this loyal love, like so devoted to these people. It means he's completely and utterly devoted to the people, regardless of how rebellious these people are. It has said this loyal love. And then he's forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. All of these are sin. It's just one way to really put an exclamation point on your statement when you repeat it 3 times in 3 different ways. Rebellion and sin. He's basically like, do you forgive wickedness? Yes, wickedness. Do you forgive rebellion? Yes, rebellion. Do you forgive? Yeah, all sin. All sin, I forgive it. That's the God I am. Now, this is the God of Exodus 34. And the God of the Old Testament can sometimes get a bad rap for the way he interacts with humanity. But this is who he says he is when he reveals himself to Moses. And in light of the situation, it's quite surprising how God chooses to define himself. We already heard what he thinks about idols, yet he is faithful with these impatient idol-worshiping people. He saved them from the Egyptians. They saw him part the Red Sea. I mean, they walked through a parted sea. Like, what more do you need to, like, God exists, right? Worthy of our praise. He provides manna and quail. He provides food from nowhere. It says from heaven. He gives water from a rock. He continues to be there for them over and over and over again. And they do this. They make a calf out of gold. They fashion it themselves, and then they worship it. This definition of who God is in Exodus 34, 5-8, this would be a very welcome message to the Israelites, that he is this God of compassion, forgiveness, faithfulness. This would be a very welcome message for them. And yet, he does say, he punishes the guilty. He punishes the children and their children to the sin of the parents, the third and fourth generation. What do we say to this? If you're like me, the first time I read that, I was like, whoa, what's this all about? I mean, if I don't come from a Christian background, like, do I have to wait a few generations? Like, or is there a curse that kind of resides over me? Is that what he's saying? There are different ways of looking at this section. Let me give you a few different options that are out there. There's the idea of you compare the values. Love and faithfulness to the thousands. It's kind of this number, it's not defined. It's just the thousands, and it's the way of saying like just keeps going. But his judgment is numbered to the third and fourth generation. So people would say this shows an emphasis on God's desire to forgive. His forgiveness essentially does not have a number, but his judgment does have a specific number. That would be more of the comparing of values. Another way to read this, people have said, is that it's the natural results of sin. Is what it's saying. So, for instance, the drug-dealing father who ends up getting put in prison for life and is not able to be a father to their child, and then that child maybe gets swept up in that and is affected in that way, that the sin of the father, of the parents, would then affect the next generation, and you can kind of get in the cycle, is one way. We're looking at transmission of maybe like HIV and AIDS. Like if someone who is HIV positive has a baby, that affects in that way. The baby then would be take that on. And the NIRV, which is like my kids' version, I always like to pick up my kids' Bible and see what it says. It actually leans toward this way in its translation. It says, "But I do not let the guilty go without punishing them. I cause the sins of the parents to affect their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren." So they're leaning in that way. And there's another one I find really helpful by D.K. Stewart. He's a commentator on this book, and it's a warning. And this is what he says. He says, this wording means something quite different from what might seem to mean to the casual reader. It does not mean that God would punish children and grandchildren for something their ancestors did, but that they themselves did not do. Rather, it describes God's just punishment of a given type of sin in each new generation as the sin continues to be repeated down through the generations. In other words, God here reminds his people that they could not rightly think something like, we can probably get away with doing this in our generation because God punished an earlier generation for doing this. So that punishment for that has already been given, and we don't have to worry about it. So it takes more of a warning approach. It's like yeah, your parents did this, but don't think that you won't be judged for it too, just because they did it. Like I'll continue judging as long as you continue to do this. Regardless of the view that you take on this, I encourage you to not shy away from this fact that God punishes sin. I'll get to a little bit more why in a minute, but I do want to handle that last verse because it's not small. Moses bowed to the ground at once and worshiped. In light of all we have talked about, this is a very appropriate response. The Bible talks about God as a holy God, a holy one, completely pure, completely unblemished, perfect, righteous in every category of his own. There is no other being in the same category as God. He stands alone as unblemished perfection. When God shows up to Moses and introduces himself, Moses doesn't just go give God a fist bump, like, what's up? Okay, right? He falls to the ground and worships him at once, it says. And the God of the Bible is a loving God. He's a devoted God. He's a compassionate God, a gracious God, a patient God, a forgiving God. But he is a holy God who deserves praise and reverence. The Bible says the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And when it's talking about fear, it's talking about this revering the Lord, having reverence toward him. And I think one of our biggest problems within some of the Christian culture is that we are far too casual with God. We don't take his holiness serious enough in just the calling that he has on our lives if we choose to follow him. Jesus didn't mince words on this. He had people turn away because his words were difficult. And I want to just kind of land this by zooming back a little bit now. I want to zoom back a little bit over this whole thing and ask a question that I hope you may be asking. God forgives wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Yet he punishes the guilty. It says it right here. It's all in the definition of who he is. And there's a tension there. He forgives wickedness, sin, and rebellion, but he punishes the guilty. And the questions that I kind of came up with when I was first reading this was like, how does he decide who to punish and who to forgive? Especially in light of my reading when I read about us all being guilty. Why can't God just forgive? Like, can he just do that? Can he just forgive? This is where the Trinitarian background is critical in terms of God simultaneously entering in the person of Christ, humbling himself, becoming a man, and at the same time sustaining the universe. As a multi-personal God, he enters into relationship. And this is the amazing thing, is that when God does come down in the person of Christ, he reveals this whole passage more fully. You see Jesus as this God-man, stands on a category of his own, which I'll talk about more tomorrow. Patient, forgiving, compassionate. He had people who the religious leaders would call sinners and kind of outcasts. He would have them wanting to be with him. Yet he's the most righteous person who ever lived. The most righteous person who ever lived had people who were kind of put to the side from God, from the religious majority, and kind of shunned. They had them actually wanting to be with him. He lived Exodus 34 out. He embodied this because he was also not gentle on sin and what it means to stand against it. And ultimately, we see this when he went to the cross. And when he showed how God can actually fulfill this Exodus 34 tension. This Exodus 34 tension that how can a loving God forgive and yet judge? And he says, you know what? Because the judge will come and he'll actually take it on for you. And in this, I will, the wages of sin is death, that I will give you my life. And in that, I will show myself to be patient, forgiving, and loving, but I also show myself to be so serious about sin that I will pay the price. And then out of that, we have mercy and forgiveness given. Question, as we close here. How many of you were really familiar with these verses tonight, these passages? Isaiah, really familiar? Okay, good. That's really good. The reason I ask this is because I think some of our biggest problems with God can come from an assumption that we understand who he is and what he's like. But if we're not continually in the Bible to have our view of God informed by this book, then we actually end up molding and shaping him into someone he is not. And when we come to the Bible, we get surprised at what we find. I didn't know God was like that. Because we've thought up and shaped him in another way. If we end up shaping God rather than him shaping us, then he will end up looking a lot more like us than looking like him. Then we will end up looking like him. And that's not a good thing. We want to be conformed into his image. When we view God as loving without being holy, we think that God is being harsh in the Bible. And if we view God as judge without love, then we are surprised and even overlook his love and forgiveness. And I want you to remember that word, hesed. It's a loyal love, completely and utterly devoted to his people, regardless of how rebellious his people are. And that reminds me of a passage. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Loyal love. He didn't wait until we cleansed ourselves and got our acts together. He came for us in the midst of rejecting him. This Trinitarian God of a relentless and never-ending love and mercy, and a God of justice. We want both. We need both. And our faith becomes anemic without both, because without both of these, our view of God is not comprehensive enough.